In the mid-1700s, the globe was largely carved up by absolute monarchs. These kings and emperors didn't rely on the consent of the governed. Their authority rested on the doctrine of the divine right of kings, a system that demanded unquestioned obedience because the ruler was supposedly chosen directly by God. The ultimate physical proof of that authority stood just outside Paris, the Palace of Versailles, with its imposing scale and sprawling gardens, was designed to overwhelm the senses and project an image of untouchable wealth. Presiding over this court was King Louis XVI. Draped in gold, velvet, and the symbols of absolute power, he inherited the throne at age 20. But beneath the royal pageantry, he was handed a nation drowning in debt from decades of foreign wars. His wife, Marie Antoinette, took royal spending to its absolute limit. While the national treasury ran dry, she ordered hundreds of new outfits a year, commissioned custom perfumes, and wore towering hairstyles embedded with pearls, feathers, and sometimes literal model boats. Outside the palace gates, reality was grim. 98 thinkers of the Enlightenment, like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, began arguing that all men were born equal, and that governments only had the right to rule with the permission of the people. Meanwhile, France's financial crisis reached a breaking point. On the verge of total economic collapse, King Louis was forced to summon the Estates General, a national advisory parliament, for the first time in 175 years, to figure out a solution. This diagram shows how the assembly was split into three groups: the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners. But the voting math was entirely rigged. Even though the Third Estate represented 98% of the country and had double the representatives in the room, each estate received exactly one collective vote. Whenever financial reforms were proposed, the clergy and nobility simply combined their two votes to outvote the commoners, ensuring the richest 2% of the country would never have to pay taxes. Realizing the system was designed to keep them powerless, the commoners demanded individual voting. When the king ignored them in locked meeting hall, they found a nearby indoor tennis court, took a unified oath, and declared themselves an independent national assembly. By stepping outside the official rules, they stripped the king of his absolute authority. In a single afternoon, the commoners transformed from subjects into a sovereign political body, lighting the fuse for a physical rebellion. Rumors quickly spread that the king was sending the military to crush the new assembly. In a panic, the citizens of Paris armed themselves and rushed the Bastille fortress on July 14, 1789, tearing into the stone walls to seize gunpowder and weapons. The unrest quickly boiled over. Months later, thousands of starving women, furious over the relentless cost of bread, marched 13 kilometers to Versailles. They breached the palace doors, cornered the royal family, and forced them back to Paris as prisoners of the people. With the king subdued, the newly empowered National Assembly drafted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a document establishing that all men were free and equal under the law. This layout illustrates how the representatives physically divided themselves when debating the details of this new society. Those supporting total equality sat on the left side of the hall, while the few remaining supporters of the monarchy and tradition sat on the right. Political ideology was no longer dictated by a divine bloodline. It was now defined by where you stood geographically in a room full of commoners, giving birth to the modern political spectrum of left-wing and right-wing. The revolution successfully dismantled the old hierarchy, but the new leaders quickly realized their republic would always be a target as long as a living king drew breath. Louis XVI was put on trial, convicted of conspiring with foreign enemies against the state, and sentenced to die. Both he and Marie Antoinette were publicly executed by the guillotine, a device designed to deliver a swift, mechanical death. Watching the French royals lose their heads sent a shockwave through the rest of Europe. Terrified that this anti-monarchist rebellion would spill across their borders, the surrounding kingdoms declared war on France. Faced with invading armies and internal economic collapse, the French government fractured. A radical faction known as the Jacobins, led by Maximilien Robespierre, seized total control of the state to manage the wartime panic. Robespierre believed the Republic was infested with royalist traitors. To protect the ideals of the revolution, he suspended basic civil liberties and initiated a period known as the Reign of Terror. If a citizen was even suspected of opposing the new government, they were labeled an enemy of the state. Nearly 16,000 people were sent to the falling blade without hard evidence or a fair trial. In a desperate attempt to force liberty and equality into existence, the revolutionaries turned on each other. They traded the tyranny of a king for the bloody tyranny of extreme paranoia. The mass executions only ended when Robespierre's own allies turned against him, sending him to the very guillotine he championed. After his death, a 5-man executive board called the Directory took over, but their rule was defined by deep corruption and ongoing chaos. The French people were exhausted. They wanted stability above all else. In 1799, a highly successful and charismatic military general named Napoleon Bonaparte saw his opening, executing a bloodless coup to take control of the government. Over the next few years, he consolidated his military and political power. In 1804, he held a public referendum, secured overwhelming support, and crowned himself Emperor of France. 10 years after starving citizens tore down the old world to build a republic, the political machinery had completed a massive, bloody circle, placing absolute authority right back into the hands of a single military dictator. Looking strictly at the timeline of leadership, you have to ask, did the French Revolution actually accomplish anything at all? The answer lies in what happened next. Napoleon ruled as an autocrat, but he was a secular one. As his armies marched across Europe, they systematically dismantled feudalism, stripping the church of its political power and installing modern administrative systems wherever they conquered. The physical Republic of France collapsed, but the concepts of liberty, equality, fraternity, and secularism survived the chaos. They became the foundational blueprint for modern democracies worldwide. Decades later, global leaders studied this exact history. Figures like Mahatma Gandhi recognized the value of the French public's demand for freedom, but specifically designed their own movements around nonviolence to avoid repeating the tragic bloodshed of Paris. In India, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar explicitly cited the French Revolution's core values when he drafted the country's constitution and fought to dismantle the rigid caste system, proving that the demand for absolute equality had a direct intellectual lineage back to 1789. The revolution failed to sustain a democracy in its own time, but in tearing down the absolute monarchy, it broke the mental chains of the ancient world, proving that human rights were not granted by kings, and releasing ideas that eventually conquered the globe.